listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is not a story you were meant to hear. In the winter of 1878, a boy was born in the quiet town of Asheville, Massachusetts. His name was Elias Monroe. By all accounts, he was an ordinary child, crying, laughing, breathing like every newborn. But then, something went wrong. As the years passed, Elias did not change. His hair did not lengthen, his bones did not grow, his face did not age. 5 years went by, then 10, then 20, and Elias remained the same, a boy of 7, frozen in time. Doctors studied him, priests condemned him, and neighbors whispered of a curse older than the town itself. Science had no language for what they saw. Medicine had no explanation. But the church said Elias was not touched by God at all. He was a vessel for something else, something ancient, something forbidden. Now pause and think about this. What if the official story, the one buried in dusty medical journals and locked away in church archives, was never about biology, but about control? What if Elias Monroe was proof of a truth that institutions feared to let loose in the world? Because here's the reality. Every society, every empire has gatekeepers. They decide what knowledge is allowed, what history is told, and which anomalies are erased. Elias wasn't just a boy who defied growth. He was a threat to the very narrative that keeps men obedient. Picture this. His parents watching helplessly year after year as their neighbors' children became men, while Elias remained unchanged. Imagine the stares in the marketplace, the cold hush of voices when he walked by, the sudden silence in church pews when his family entered. He was not growing, but something around him was fear. And fear, my friend, is the strongest weapon institutions have ever wielded. You were never supposed to hear of Elias Monroe. His name was meant to dissolve into forgotten dust. But history has cracks, and through those cracks, truth seeps out. Men like you, men who hunger for forbidden knowledge, must ask, why was his story suppressed? What did his existence reveal that terrified the church, the doctors, and the state alike? And most importantly, why does his secret still matter? Right now, in your life. Because the story of Elias Monroe is not about one child in 1878. It is about you. It is about all of us. It is about the chains forged in silence, the ones you cannot see, but feel tightening every day. Elias Monroe's existence was more than a medical curiosity. It was a rupture in the script of reality. And when reality fractures, those in power move quickly to seal the wound. The doctors who examined him wrote cautious reports, littered with words like unexplainable, anomaly, stagnation of growth. But their notes were quietly filed away, never published, never circulated beyond tightly locked archives. Why? Because Elias wasn't merely an exception to the rule of biology. He was evidence that the rules themselves were written by men, not by nature. Rules that could be broken. Rules that, once broken, would reveal how fragile their control truly was. The church called Elias a deception of the devil. The state labeled him a danger to public order. But neither dared ask the real question. What if Elias was not failing to grow, but was refusing to grow? What if his body, his very being, had escaped the system we are all trapped in? The clockwork of time, the slow erosion of flesh, the inevitability of decay. Think about it. Every empire, every hierarchy, every economy is built on one inescapable law. Man must grow, man must age, man must die. If even one child could slip outside that law, then the foundation of power crumbles. You see, institutions survive by turning life itself into a transaction. They tax your time, your labor, your years. They train you to believe that every passing day makes you weaker, less valuable, closer to nothing. But Elias's body spat in the face of that tyranny. He was not profitable. He could not be controlled. He did not age into the obedient worker or the submissive believer. He stood still, an unmovable question mark carved into the timeline of humanity. And so, as whispers spread, the town of Ashvale changed. Men began to question their priests. Mothers whispered to their children that maybe death was not inevitable. Rumors swirled that Elias was not cursed but chosen, that he held within him a key, a secret the old world wanted destroyed. Fear turned to fascination, fascination to unrest, and unrest to danger. Because when men begin to believe they can step outside the cage, the keepers of the cage will do anything to crush that belief. The fate of Elias Monroe would not be written by nature, but by power. And the decisions made in smoke-filled rooms and candle-lit chapels would determine not just his destiny, but yours. By the year 1893, Elias Monroe had lived 15 years beyond his birth. Yet his face remained that of a boy no older than 7. Imagine that, an eternal child walking among men who now bore the lines of work, the weight of years, the gray of age. To see him was to be reminded that time itself might not be absolute, and that reminder was dangerous. The town elders of Ashvale, guided by whispers from the church, began to treat Elias not as a child, but as an omen. They claimed his presence distorted the natural order, that his very being would invite ruin. But behind the sermons and official decrees was something far simpler: fear of losing control. Because what happens when men stop believing in the chains that bind them? The chains snap. And when the chains snap, so do the empires built upon them. Let me reveal something most people never consider. Institutions thrive not because their systems are flawless, but because people believe in those systems. Time, money, death, salvation. These are not merely natural realities. They are psychological frameworks. Break one of them, and the entire house of cards trembles. Elias was a living fracture, and they couldn't allow him to exist. So the church sent emissaries, solemn men in dark coats who spoke in riddles about preserving order. Doctors from Boston arrived, whispering of new experiments, their eyes gleaming not with compassion, but with the hunger of men who sense proximity to forbidden knowledge. And all the while, Elias remained silent, staring at them with the eyes of a child who should have aged decades ago, yet carried something ageless in his gaze. Witnesses said that looking into his eyes was like falling into a pit, endless, timeless, cold. Some swore the boy could see through them, as though measuring their souls against something they themselves could not name. Soon, rumors spread of secret tests performed in the basements of Ashvale's infirmary. Strange devices humming in the night, chants half hidden beneath the drone of machinery. Some said the doctors were not trying to understand Elias. They were trying to extract something from him, a formula, a key, a weapon against mortality itself. But you and I both know how this works. When the powerful see an anomaly, they don't ask how to free mankind with it. They ask how to own it, how to monetize it, how to weaponize it. And while Elias's body did not grow, something else was growing all around him: interest, obsession, and the cold machinery of control. By 1897, Elias Monroe was no longer a mystery, hidden in a quiet town. He had become an obsession of the elite. Wealthy benefactors, government men, even occult societies that met in candlelit chambers, all turned their eyes toward the boy who did not age. His family, once simple townsfolk, now lived under constant surveillance. Every visitor, every letter, every breath was monitored. Elias was no longer a child. He was property. And that is the first lesson most men refuse to see. The moment you possess something the system cannot explain, you no longer belong to yourself. You become a resource, a specimen, an object to be dissected by the very institutions that claim to protect you. Elias was paraded before doctors who spoke of growth plates and cellular anomalies. They drew his blood, measured his bones, tested his reflexes. Yet no change ever came. No growth, no decay. Just eternal stillness. But what terrified them most was not his body, it was his mind. By all appearances, Elias should have been a child in thought as well as form. Yet witnesses reported that his speech carried a gravity far beyond his years. He asked questions that unsettled grown men. He spoke of time as though it were a prison, of life as though it were a dream. One physician recorded in his notes, "When I asked Elias what he desired most, he replied, 'Freedom from the wheel.' I did not understand what he meant. Freedom from the wheel." Do you understand the weight of those words? Every man you know is trapped on that wheel. Birth, growth, work, decline, death. It spins endlessly, grinding down generations. But Elias seemed to see beyond it. He refused to play the role written for him. And that defiance made him more dangerous than any weapon. So the doctors proposed a solution. Isolation. Remove him from public view. Study him in silence. Contain the anomaly. And so Elias disappeared. The newspapers never reported it. The town of Ashvale whispered that he had died of fever, but no grave was dug, no stone erected. Elias simply vanished, taken into the hands of those who feared him most. And here is the truth no man wants to admit. When something cannot be explained, it will not be celebrated. It will be silenced. Elias Monroe was not the first anomaly. He was simply one of the few who slipped through the cracks long enough to be remembered. And even then, only in whispers. When Elias vanished in 1897, the people of Ashvale were left with nothing but silence. His parents were given a meager sum of money and told never to speak of him again. His friends, those few who dared play beside him, were told he had died. And the town, eager to forget the unsettling anomaly in their midst, obeyed. But not everyone forgot. The truth is, Elias Monroe's disappearance was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of something much darker. Whispers began to circulate of a facility hidden on the outskirts of Boston, funded not by the government directly, but by private patrons. These were not ordinary men. They were the wealthy elite, the ones who built railroads, owned banks, and whispered in the ears of senators. Men who understood that knowledge is the greatest form of power, and anomalies like Elias were not curiosities to them, but tools. What they wanted was simple: control over time itself. Imagine it: to halt aging, to preserve youth, to freeze life at will. Entire empires could be built upon that discovery. Imagine soldiers who never wither, workers who never collapse, leaders who never die. It would mean the end of change, the end of resistance, the end of hope. Because if those who already rule never grow old, never weaken, then their power becomes eternal. That is why Elias mattered. That is why he was taken. Records that survived in fragments, hidden letters, discarded notes, speak of experiments performed in candlelit halls where doctors and priests worked side by side. Some claimed they were trying to unlock Elias, to break the code in his blood. Others whispered they were trying to contain him, to prevent whatever force sustained him from infecting the rest of mankind. Because here lies the paradox. What empowers one man threatens all who depend on control. But the most chilling testimony comes from a single diary entry written by a physician's apprentice. He described Elias, strapped to a chair, silent, staring straight ahead as the men debated his fate. And when one of them shouted, demanding to know what he was, Elias spoke only 4 words. "I am not yours." Think about that. Not yours. Not theirs. Not even his own. What was Elias Monroe? Was he human at all? Or was he something else wearing the face of a child? Something that could not be owned, could not be tamed, could not be bent to the will of institutions? And if so, what did they do to silence him? The deeper you follow Elias Monroe's trail, the more the lines blur between science and something far older, something ritualistic, something drenched in shadow. Reports from Boston in the early 1900s describe clandestine gatherings where doctors, priests, and scholars of the occult stood side by side, staring at Elias as though he were not a boy, but a doorway. Their language shifted. They stopped calling him a patient. They began calling him a vessel. Understand this. When power encounters the unexplainable, it does not seek truth. It seeks utility. If Elias's body defied time, then his existence became a canvas for every hunger men had ever carried, for immortality, for dominion, for godhood itself. And in their desperation, they reached beyond the realm of medicine, pulling from texts that were never meant for mortal eyes. Ancient tomes whispered of children who stood outside the wheel, beings who were not cursed but set apart. Some cultures revered them as prophets, others feared them as omens. And yet in every account one pattern remained. Such children did not live long. They were consumed by the people, by the rulers, by the rituals. Eyewitnesses later described strange ceremonies performed in hidden halls. Circles drawn on the floor, chants in languages older than Europe, symbols carved into wood and stone. Elias was placed in the center, surrounded by men who sought to extract what he carried. To them, he was no longer human. He was an equation, a cipher, a key to unlock the machinery of time. And if unlocking it demanded sacrifice, then so be it. Institutions have always cloaked their cruelty in the language of progress. But here is what unsettled them most. Elias did not resist. He sat in silence, eyes empty yet piercing, as though he understood the futility of their struggle, as though he pitied them. Witnesses claimed that when the chanting grew loudest, the boy would simply whisper a word, barely audible, yet enough to send chills through the room. Some swore that candles extinguished themselves, that walls seemed to bend, that clocks stopped ticking when Elias spoke. Science calls these exaggerations. I call them fractures in the veil, and yet no breakthrough came. No elixir of immortality, no formula to bottle eternity. Instead, what remained was fear. The more they probed Elias, the more they realized that his existence was not a gift to be used, but a mirror held up to their own corruption, a reminder that they were the prisoners, not him. So ask yourself, what do powerful men do when they cannot own what they fear? They erase it. By the turn of the century, Elias Monroe had become less a child than a liability. His body still refused to change, his face frozen in boyhood, while the men around him grew older, weaker, more desperate. They had failed to extract his secret. They had failed to bend him to their will. And in their failure, a dangerous realization took root. Elias was not theirs to command. He was proof that there existed forces outside their grasp, truths they could not regulate, anomalies they could not own. That realization was intolerable, so they chose a path far older than science, far simpler than ritual. They chose erasure. The first step was silence. Reports were destroyed. Medical notes vanished. Journal entries were confiscated. Families who had once spoken of Elias were visited by officials carrying envelopes of money and warnings sealed with blood. Even the town of Asheville, where he was born, seemed to recoil from memory itself. church records burned, census entries altered, gravestones rearranged. It was as if the boy had never existed. And here lies one of the greatest weapons of institutional power, the control of memory. Do not think for a second that history is a record of what happened. History is a record of what was permitted to be remembered. Elias Monroe was not the first anomaly to be buried beneath false narratives, nor would he be the last. When men stumble upon truths that cannot be harnessed, those truths are buried, rewritten, denied. The world you think you know is not reality. It is a carefully edited version, trimmed and censored until it produces obedience. But erasure alone was not enough. Rumors still lingered, stories passed in whispers from father to son. To smother those embers, they built a counter-narrative. Elias, they said, was a hoax, a carnival trick, a tale invented by charlatans to scare children. They dressed his story in ridicule until the very mention of his name became laughable in academic circles. And in doing so, they achieved what all institutions strive for, not just silence, but scorn. Because when ridicule replaces memory, the truth is buried deeper than any grave, yet anomalies cannot be erased completely. They leave shadows, subtle imprints that men like you can still trace if you dare. And that is why you are here now, listening to me. Because Elias Monroe was not just a boy who refused to grow, he was a crack in the facade, a glimpse at how fragile their system truly is. And cracks, no matter how small, always spread. The erasure of Elias Monroe was not an isolated act, it was a blueprint. Once the powerful realized they could bury a living anomaly beneath silence and ridicule, they discovered a method of control more effective than prisons or swords. And from that moment on, every forbidden truth, every inconvenient revelation was treated the same way. It wasn't enough to kill the body or burn the evidence. No, the true victory was in rewriting memory itself. Think about it. How many stories from history have you never heard? Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important. How many names have been stripped from the record? Not because they were insignificant, but because they were dangerous. The story of Elias Monroe was simply one thread in a much larger tapestry of suppression. The same machinery that erased him was used to bury countless other truths, lost inventions, suppressed manuscripts, experiments that never saw the light of day. And what makes this system so effective is that it doesn't just silence knowledge, it trains the masses to mock it, to laugh at it, to dismiss it as myth, superstition, nonsense. By doing this, the gatekeepers don't need to chase every whisper. They let society itself police the boundaries of reality. If you bring up Elias Monroe today, most will smirk, shake their heads, and walk away. That is the power of institutional ridicule. It builds walls in the mind stronger than any prison. But here's the question they don't want you asking. Why repeat the pattern? Why erase and ridicule anomalies over and over if they are truly meaningless? Why not just let them fade into obscurity on their own? The answer is simple. Because anomalies are not meaningless. They are cracks in the architecture of control. Cracks that, if followed, could reveal the blueprint of the entire system. Elias was more than a child who defied science. He was a mirror showing men that time itself could be broken, that the wheel of growth and decay was not absolute. And once you glimpse that possibility, you can never look at the world the same way again. That is why they erased him. Not because he was nothing, but because he was everything they feared. And here, my friend, is where the descent deepens. Because once you recognize the pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. Every silence, every coincidence, every story that doesn't add up, it all begins to form a picture. And that picture is far darker than you've been led to believe. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Elias Monroe's erasure was not a strange footnote. It was part of a system, a method perfected over centuries. Consider the countless other anomalies, quietly buried under the weight of official history. The Voynich manuscript, an ancient text written in a language no one can decode, dismissed as a meaningless curiosity. Nikola Tesla's lost papers, confiscated by government agents the night he died, explained away as paranoia. Entire civilizations whose ruins suggest technology and knowledge far beyond their supposed era, labeled as coincidences or misinterpretations. This is how control works. Not through open chains, but through silence. Not through outright denial, but through reframing. Every discovery that could expand your vision of reality is either ridiculed until you laugh at it yourself, or rewritten until you no longer recognize its meaning. And the most dangerous truths, they are erased so thoroughly you don't even know you've lost them. Elias Monroe was a child who stood outside the law of time. But to admit his existence was to admit that time itself could bend. And if time could bend, then the entire machinery of aging, death, and progress, machinery that keeps men obedient, was revealed for what it truly is: a cage. The same system that convinces you to trade your youth for labor, your years for currency, your life for obedience. Control is never about brute force alone. Chains and prisons can only hold the body. True domination requires something far deeper, the imprisonment of thought. The erasure of Elias Monroe was not simply about silencing his existence, it was about shaping the minds of those left behind. And that is the most chilling truth of all. They didn't just remove him from history. They rewired reality itself so that men would no longer even consider the possibility of someone like him existing. Think of it this way. A chain is obvious. You feel its weight, you know you're bound. But a belief is invisible. It binds you without your knowledge. When you accept that time is unbreakable, that aging and death are unavoidable, you stop looking for cracks in the system. You live as they want you to live, obedient, predictable, drained of hope for anything beyond the script. That is the genius of institutional control. They don't just silence dissent. They manufacture the very limits of your imagination. Elias was a threat not because he escaped the wheel, but because he showed others that the wheel could be escaped. That was intolerable. So the system responded with the greatest weapon it has ever wielded: forgetfulness. Forgetfulness makes men docile. Forgetfulness makes chains invisible. Forgetfulness ensures that the questions you should be asking never cross your mind. But here's the part they don't want you to know. Every act of erasure leaves scars. The story of Elias Monroe did not vanish completely. It slipped through cracks. In forgotten letters, in whispers among secret societies, in the fevered writings of men who could not let go of what they had seen. That is how you and I are speaking of him now. He survived, not in flesh, but in shadow. And shadows can be more dangerous than light, because they slip where no chains can bind them. This is why you must pay attention. Because Elias Monroe's story is not about one child lost to history. It is about the machinery that erased him, a machinery still at work today, erasing anomalies, burying truths, and reshaping memory. The question you must ask yourself is not, what happened to Elias? But, what has already been erased from my life that I will never know? You feel it, don't you? That unease. That sense that the world you've been handed is a staged performance. That behind the curtain, something vast and silent waits. Elias was one glimpse of it. And now that you've seen the crack, you can never return to blindness. Do you understand now why they erased him? It wasn't about Elias. It was about you. About making sure you never believed you could step outside the script. Because once a man believes he can escape the wheel, he becomes dangerous. And here is where I must ask you to stop and think, because this video is not just a story. It is a descent, a transformation. If you've followed me this far, then you are not the average man. You are not asleep. You are not laughing this away. You feel the pull of the forbidden, the whisper of truths buried in silence. Halfway through this journey, I want you to prove it. Write in the comments the phrase, "I step outside the wheel. I step outside the wheel." Do it twice. Why? Because repetition locks identity. Ritual solidifies transformation. And in speaking those words, you are not just engaging an algorithm. You are declaring war on the cage they built for you. Elias Monroe's secret was stolen from him. Yours does not have to be. Erasing Elias Monroe was only the beginning. Once they silenced him, once they scrubbed his name from memory, they faced an irresistible temptation: replication. Because institutions never let anomalies simply vanish. They dissect them, study them, and then try to build them again in secret. Elias was proof that the laws of nature could bend. To men drunk on power, that was not a warning. It was an invitation. In the years following his disappearance, whispers emerged of experiments scattered across America and Europe. Children taken from orphanages, infants from poor families, the forgotten and unmissed. Subjects placed in hidden facilities where medicine blurred into ritual, where science bled into something older, darker. Records that surfaced decades later speak of enforced fasting, chemical injections, exposure to sound frequencies and symbols. They were searching for something Elias carried naturally, something they could not replicate. But here's the truth: anomalies cannot be manufactured. They are ruptures in the system, not products of it. And every attempt to replicate Elias led only to horror. Some children withered before their time. Others fell into states of madness, speaking in tongues no one could understand. A few simply stopped aging, stopped speaking, stopped moving like statues that still breathed. They were anomalies, yes, but broken ones, imperfect shadows of Elias. Do you see the pattern? When power cannot control the natural, it creates the unnatural. And in doing so, it spreads corruption deeper into the world. Elias was not theirs, so they tried to force others into his mold. This is how institutions operate, not by revering what is beyond them, but by twisting it into something they can weaponize. And what of Elias himself? Here the trail grows darker. There are fragments, testimonies of a boy seen in the halls of an underground facility outside Boston in 1904, still unchanged, still 7. Another mention surfaces in 1912 in the diary of a government agent who wrote, "The child is ageless. He does not resist. He only watches. It is unbearable." After that, the trail fades. Did Elias survive? Did he escape? Or was he finally destroyed when they realized they could not replicate him? The silence screams louder than words. But mark this well: Elias's shadow lived on. Not as a boy walking among men, but as an idea buried deep inside the machinery of control. The pursuit of immortality, the obsession with time, the urge to shackle life itself. These obsessions did not end with him. They expanded. They became the hidden spine of modern power. The story of Elias Monroe did not die with his disappearance. It transformed. By the early 20th century, the obsession with his anomaly shifted focus. If they could not control the body that defied time, then perhaps they could control the mind that perceived it. That was the next battlefield. The wheel Elias refused to obey was not just physical, it was psychological. And if men could not step outside the wheel naturally, then institutions would make sure they never even imagined doing so. This is when psychology, once a study of human thought, was weaponized. Figures you've been taught to admire, pioneers of psychiatry, architects of behavioral science, were not simply doctors. Many were funded, guided, and manipulated by the same hidden hands that once circled Elias Monroe. They asked a terrifying question. What if control could be planted not in chains, but in the mind itself? The answer birthed programs most people never hear about in school. Experiments where suggestion, trauma, and repetition were used to rewire the human spirit. Entire institutions, hospitals, schools, asylums, became testing grounds. And what was their aim? To make sure no man ever glimpsed the cracks Elias revealed. To ensure obedience, predictability, conformity. If Elias was a symbol of freedom from the wheel, then psychological control became the iron bars that locked men deeper inside it. But here's the part they don't teach you. Elias's anomaly shaped their obsession. His silence, his refusal to play by the rules, haunted them. It was proof that the human condition was not fixed, that the system could be broken. And so, rather than admit defeat, they decided to build a stronger prison, one not of stone, but of thought. They taught men to laugh at forbidden truths, to mock anomalies, to sneer at the very possibility of freedom. They wrapped their control in science, in medicine, in progress. And the masses believed. They still believe. Every time you dismiss a strange story as nonsense, every time you laugh at whispers of the forbidden, you are playing their game. You are strengthening the very bars they built for you. Elias Monroe was one boy who refused to grow. But what they fear now is not Elias. It is you, the man who dares to listen, to question, to see through the veil. Because once you step outside their psychological prison, their power collapses. And that is why this story is dangerous. Because knowledge of Elias Monroe does not stay in history, it lives in you. By the 1920s, the obsession with Elias Monroe had mutated into something larger than one boy. His existence, his refusal to age, became the seed for a new kind of science, a hidden fusion between medicine, psychology, and ritual. What had once been whispered in the shadows of Boston laboratories was now being carried into state-funded projects, private societies, and occult fraternities with unlimited wealth. And though Elias himself had faded into silence, his shadow walked at the heart of it all. This was the birth of what I call the hybrid science of control. A field never taught in classrooms, never written into your textbooks, yet it shaped the 20th century more than any war or election. On one side, you had the men of reason, scientists, physicians, psychologists, demanding measurable results. On the other, you had the men of ritual, priests, mystics, secret orders, drawing symbols in the dark and speaking of forces older than empires. Normally, these two worlds would reject each other. But Elias was proof that something existed. Between them, something neither could explain alone. And so they joined hands, not out of trust, but out of hunger. Documents buried in private collections reveal experiments that read like nightmares. Children isolated in dark rooms, their perception of time distorted by artificial cycles of light and shadow. Subjects drugged until their sense of self dissolved, then bombarded with repeated phrases, chants disguised as science. Machines designed not to heal the body, but to disrupt the mind. And always, hovering in the background, was Elias, the prototype anomaly, the boy outside the wheel. They were not trying to cure humanity. They were trying to recreate him. But here's the part they'll never confess. What they feared most was not failure, but success. Because if they ever truly replicated Elias, if they ever created men who could step outside the wheel, those men would not serve them. They would break free. And so the experiments shifted. The goal was no longer to produce anomalies, but to prevent them, to choke off the possibility of another Elias ever emerging. This, my friend, is the origin of the systems you live under today. Schools that train obedience, media that mocks forbidden thought, medicine that treats symptoms but never cures, religion twisted into control rather than liberation. Every structure you see around you was sharpened in the crucible of Elias Monroe's shadow, because once you glimpse that the wheel can be broken, you are no longer a prisoner. And once enough men see the cracks, the entire prison collapses. That is what they fear. That is why they erased Elias. That is why they built this system. By the 1930s, the hybrid science born in Elias Monroe's shadow had found a new home. The laboratories of progress, hidden behind the banners of national security and medical advancement. What began as secret rituals in basements was now wrapped in the language of patriotism and science. Governments across the world, desperate for an edge in an unstable century, poured wealth into experiments that the public would never be allowed to see. Understand this clearly. Every war, every crisis, every emergency creates an opening for hidden hands to expand their machinery. In the chaos of the Great Depression and the growing threat of global conflict, the guardians of control seized their chance. Under the veil of research into psychology, pharmacology, and even weaponry, they built laboratories dedicated not to healing but to mastering the architecture of the human mind. At first, the projects mirrored the obsessions of the Elias era. Could time be bent? Could aging be slowed? Could soldiers be trained to endure without breaking, to resist decay itself? Reports speak of injections, strange diets, even exposure to high-frequency sound waves intended to disrupt cellular growth. But as before, they failed to replicate Elias. No child remained untouched by the wheel, no body defied time. Every attempt at immortality collapsed into sickness, madness, or silence. And so the focus shifted. If they could not stop the wheel, they could strengthen its prison. Rather than freeing man from time, they decided to chain his perception more tightly to it. This is when the science of control evolved into psychological warfare. Imagine it. Entire research teams dedicated not to making men free, but to making them predictable. Entire laboratories searching for ways to bend thought, break will, reprogram memory. You've heard fragments of this history, names like behavioral conditioning, hypnosis, electroshock therapy, but you were never told their true origin. These were not simply medical curiosities. They were born from the failure of Elias Monroe's secret. Because once the elites realized they could not own eternity, they settled for the next best thing, the illusion of eternity. A system so absolute, so self-reinforcing, that men would never again dream of stepping outside the wheel. This is why the 20th century unfolded as it did. Wars became theaters of experimentation. Asylums became laboratories. Schools became factories of obedience. Every system built in that century carried within it the shadow of Elias Monroe, because he had shown them what was possible, and they swore no man would ever see it again. World War II. To the public, it was a war of nations, ideologies, and armies clashing on battlefields. But beneath the smoke and fire, it was something darker. A laboratory for control. An opportunity to take the forbidden sciences of Elias Monroe's shadow and expand them on a scale the world had never seen. War gave them cover. War gave them bodies. War gave them silence. You've been told the story of battles, generals, and victory speeches. But the real war wasn't just about territory. It was about man himself. Both sides of the conflict, the Allies and the Axis, dug deep into occult sciences and psychological warfare. Nazi Germany openly sought mystical relics, ancient bloodlines, and experiments in human endurance that bordered on the inhuman. But what you're never taught is that the Allies mirrored them in silence. While one side flaunted its occult hunger, the other cloaked its work in the sterile language of research, medicine, and strategy. Different costumes, same play, hidden beneath concentration camps, beneath psychiatric wards, beneath military hospitals, experiments unfolded that would later be scrubbed from every textbook. Children tested for their resistance to cold, starvation, isolation, scientists watching, recording, measuring the breaking point of the human body. Prisoners dosed with chemicals, their perception shattered, their minds stripped down to raw obedience. And hovering at the edges of those files, always, was the ghost of Elias Monroe, the boy who refused to age, the anomaly who revealed that the wheel could, under certain circumstances, be broken. The war wasn't just about control of land. It was about control of memory, perception, and time itself. Elias had proved that nature could be disrupted. The war was their chance to take that disruption and weaponize it. Imagine an army of men whose will could be bent, whose fear could be erased, whose loyalty was absolute. Not free men, not anomalies. Manufactured soldiers, chained not by iron, but by the architecture of their own minds. And when the war ended, the laboratories didn't close. The scientists didn't vanish. They were absorbed, welcomed into new nations, hidden under new flags. Operation Paperclip in the United States, secret Soviet programs in the East. Both sides swallowed the forbidden knowledge whole. The blood of millions had hidden their work, and now, with the world distracted by rebuilding, they had freedom to perfect it. This is the turning point. The moment when the science of control left the shadows and stepped into the machinery of modern power. From here on, Elias Monroe was no longer a forgotten anomaly. He was a blueprint. The Cold War was not just an arms race. It was a war for the human mind itself. Nuclear missiles and tanks made headlines, but the true battlefield stretched across the invisible terrain of memory, perception, and willpower. Nations did not simply want to conquer land. They wanted to conquer thought. They wanted to engineer obedience, loyalty, and fear at the cellular level. And out of this hunger, the ghost of Elias Monroe returned in a new form. You may know the name MK-Ultra. To the public, it is a conspiracy, a rumor, a tale whispered by those who see too much. But to the inner circle, it was a sanctioned laboratory of forbidden science. What began in the quiet shadows of Elias Monroe's anomaly, the possibility of bending the natural order, evolved into a full-scale project to master the architecture of human identity. Documents, though heavily redacted, reveal the shape of their ambition. They tested chemicals that could shatter memory. They perfected methods of breaking down the ego until nothing remained but fragments, blank slates ready to be rewritten. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electric shocks, hallucinogens, all tools not of healing but of deconstruction. And always the same question. Could a man be rebuilt into something other than himself? Could a soldier be programmed like a machine? Could obedience be installed like a script? But beneath the surface of these projects was something older, an obsession tied directly to Elias Monroe. Some of the researchers believed that the key to his condition was not merely biological, but spiritual, even dimensional. They whispered of a state of being where the self was frozen, detached from the wheel of time. What if, they asked, memory could be fractured in such a way that time itself no longer mattered? What if identity could be severed from the prison of years, leaving only fragments that could be shuffled, rearranged, or paused? Think about it. Elias did not age. He did not grow. He existed in a kind of stasis. The men of MK-Ultra were not merely creating broken soldiers, they were attempting to recreate stasis through control. And though the results were inconsistent, terrifying and often fatal, the pursuit itself was the true victory. Because once they understood that human identity could be dismantled, they realized the world could be controlled without chains, without prisons, without bars. All you needed was the right key, the right trauma, the right script whispered into the hollowed mind. This was no longer science, it was ritual disguised as research. And the men behind it knew they were closer than ever to building a society of engineered identities chained not by time, but by programming. What they learned in the shadows of MK Ultra never stayed in the shadows. That's the part most men never understand. They think it ended when the files were burned, when the experiments were shut down. But the truth, nothing ever ends. It only changes form. Once the elite discovered that the human mind could be fractured, rewritten, and redirected, they no longer needed the laboratory. The laboratory became the culture itself. Look around you. The screens that never shut off, the music engineered not to inspire but to program, the endless stream of news designed not to inform but to fracture perception. This is not coincidence. This is system. What once was forced on unwilling test subjects is now consumed willingly by billions. They no longer need to strap electrodes to your skull. All they need is the phone in your hand, the television on your wall, the classroom where your children sit. Education became one of the first tools, not teaching but conditioning, reward systems that punish independent thought. Histories scrubbed clean of forbidden knowledge, replaced with narratives designed to pacify. They want men docile, predictable, identical. The anomalies, like Elias, Monroe, were their greatest threat because he proved that nature could break the script. So they buried him in silence and built an entire machinery to ensure no one else would ever slip through the cracks. Religion, too, became part of the system. Institutions that once carried fire in their words became husks, repeating safe liturgies that keep you obedient, never dangerous. Sermons designed to make you meek, not strong. Promises of salvation designed not to free you, but to keep you, waiting, while the real rulers tightened their grip on the living world. And then there's media. Do you think it's an accident that movies, television, and music glorify distraction, weakness, and obedience? Do you think it's a mistake that every hero is either broken, aimless, or dependent on authority? This is not entertainment. This is programming, the evolution of MK Ultra. Where once they had to shatter one mind at a time, now they shatter millions at once. And you, sitting here, listening to these words, you already know this truth in your bones. You felt it every time you sensed a lie behind the smiling face of an anchor, every time you read a history book that felt incomplete, every time your instincts told you that something vital was being hidden. You were right. You were sensing the shadow of the same machinery that began in war, but now stretches into every corner of modern life. This is why they bury Elias Monroe, because his existence was proof that the script of time could be broken. And if one boy could defy the system of growth and decay, then so could a man defy the system of mental chains. They fear that awakening. They fear you remembering. Why do they fear anomalies so much? Why bury every trace of Elias Monroe, every document, every witness, until his name was almost erased from history? Because anomalies prove one thing: the system is not absolute. The laws you were taught to obey without question, laws of time, laws of growth, laws of obedience, are not iron cages. They are cages of perception. And if one boy can step outside the cycle, it means you can too. The elite understand this better than anyone. Their greatest fear is not chaos, not rebellion. It is the awakening of the individual mind. A man who awakens is no longer predictable. He stops consuming what they feed him. He sees through their rituals of distraction. He becomes dangerous, not because he raises a weapon, but because he withdraws his obedience. And obedience, not violence, is the true lifeblood of every empire. Think about the last time you questioned the narrative, the last time you noticed something didn't add up. Maybe you were told you were crazy, paranoid, delusional. That's the reflex of the control system. They want you to doubt yourself before you doubt them. That is the mechanism they perfected after Elias Monroe. Because they learned, if anomalies cannot be prevented, they can be discredited, silenced, shamed into disappearance. The hidden secret is this: every man carries the anomaly inside him, the ability to resist programming, the ability to reject the script, the ability to carve a path outside the inevitability of the system. But most men never awaken it, because they are trained from childhood to suppress that inner voice, to suffocate instinct under layers of authority. They are taught that growth means conformity, that wisdom means obedience, that maturity means surrender. But Elias Monroe, frozen, untouched, unbroken, was a living reminder that time itself could be resisted. He was a mirror of potential, and they shattered that mirror before others could see themselves reflected in it. You were never meant to know this. That's why you're hearing these words now, because some part of you already suspects the truth. And once you see the cage for what it is, you cannot unsee it. That is the beginning of transformation. That is the threshold they never want you to cross. But here's the real danger. Anomalies are not only erased, they are weaponized. The same forces that destroy them also attempt to harness them. And what they did with Elias was only the beginning. Suppression was only the surface. Erasure was the camouflage. The truth, hidden in sealed files and whispered testimonies, is that Elias Monroe was not simply destroyed, he was harvested. His anomaly became a template. The elite do not waste potential, not when it reveals a crack in reality itself. They consume it, weaponize it, reforge it into another tool of control. Think of it: a boy who did not grow, who remained unchanged as time moved forward. To the frightened, this was a curse. To the manipulators, it was a treasure. If such a state could be replicated, controlled, or induced, what would it mean for soldiers, for spies, for rulers who never wished to grow old? Imagine the endless experiments, the silent chambers where his blood was tested, his cells studied, his mind broken open for hidden mechanisms. They weren't asking, "Why did this happen?" They were asking, "How can we own it?" And that's the pattern you must see. Every anomaly becomes a prototype. Every miracle becomes a weapon. Every exception to the system is swallowed by the system itself. That is how they maintain dominance, not by erasing possibility, but by monopolizing it. You never hear about it because by the time it reaches the surface, it is no longer a mystery. It is a product, a weapon, a new form of control, disguised as progress. Consider the timeline. Elias vanishes from public record in 1878. Decades later, the world sees the rise of institutions obsessed with genetic control, life extension research, and the manipulation of human biology. Is it coincidence? Or was his bloodline, his anomaly, the seed that sprouted into entire programs of eugenics and experimental medicine? Ask yourself, why do so many elite dynasties seem untouched by time? Their faces preserved, their grip unshaken across generations. Could it be that Elias was the first key, the proof that time itself could be bent, slowed, controlled? If that sounds impossible, remember this. What you are allowed to know is always a generation behind what they already possess. By the time you hear about cloning, they've already moved on. By the time you hear about artificial intelligence, they're already integrating it into governance. And by the time you hear about life extension therapies, they've already buried the truth that such experiments began with anomalies like Elias. They tell you stories of fairy tales, children who never grow, men who live forever, so that when the truth slips through, you dismiss it as myth. That is the cruelest manipulation of all. hiding reality behind the mask of fantasy. And Elias Monroe? He was the first chapter of that forbidden book. Every culture has its fairy tales, its myths, its legends of those who defy the natural order. A child who never ages. A man who walks through centuries untouched. A woman whose face never withers. You were told these were bedtime stories, fabrications to entertain or to frighten. But what if I told you they were fragments of records, distorted through time, designed to conceal anomalies like Elias Monroe? Think about it. Folklore doesn't spring from nothing. It anchors itself in something observed, something whispered, something too dangerous to record as fact. The Brothers Grimm, for instance, didn't invent their stories out of thin air. They collected them, preserved echoes of events too unsettling for the official record. Tales of eternal youth, changelings and children who did not belong. Do you see the thread now? These weren't fairy tales, they were redacted files disguised as folklore. And who kept these records? The elite, the ruling dynasties, the church, the secret orders. Always the same hands guiding the archive of human memory. When Elias's case emerged, it wasn't the first time. It was simply one of the rare instances that slipped into public awareness before being smothered. But beneath the surface, such anomalies were catalogued, compared, and folded into the forbidden book, the hidden ledger of impossibilities. That book was never meant for you. It was never meant for any of us. It is the private scripture of power. Within it, myths are reinterpreted not as fantasy, but as raw data. Legends become case studies. Every whispered account of someone escaping time, bending nature, or resisting the body's decay, these are studied, dissected, and weaponized. And once that knowledge is secured, the narrative is reshaped, fed back to the masses as harmless folklore. The truth transformed into entertainment, so you never suspect its origin. Ask yourself, why do the same myths appear across every culture? Eternal youth. Ageless wanderers, children untouched by time. Do you really believe humanity invented the same stories in isolation? Or is it more likely that these myths record the same phenomenon, witnessed in different places, in different centuries? Elias Monroe wasn't unique. He was one of many, part of a lineage of anomalies that were never supposed to be seen, never supposed to be remembered. And this is where the descent grows darker. Once you realize that myths are not fantasy, but encrypted truths, you begin to see the full scale of manipulation. You begin to see how your reality was shaped, not for your growth, but for your containment. Containment was never only about Elias. It was about you, about all of us. The anomaly was never the child, it was the possibility he represented. If one boy could resist the natural march of time, then everything you've been told about life, aging, and decay is not inevitable, it's engineered. And that, my friend, is the knowledge they could never allow to spread. So they created a different system of control, a psychological cage. They embedded it into culture, into education, into the very way you think. From the moment you could understand words, you were told, fairy tales aren't real, myths are make-believe, legends are entertainment. The stories of ageless wanderers, eternal children, immortal kings, they conditioned you to dismiss them as harmless fiction. What better way to hide the truth than to mock it as fantasy? This is the true genius of institutional manipulation. They do not need to burn every book, silence every witness, or erase every anomaly. They only need to train your mind to reject the possibility before it even enters your awareness. You self-police. You laugh at what you should fear. You dismiss what you should question. You bury the seed of doubt before it grows. That is how control perpetuates itself, not through brute force, but through shaping perception itself. Now think about Elias Monroe. His story was buried in medical records, but fragments remained. Whispers leaked, legends circulated, and eventually the case became a ghost story among locals. A curiosity, a myth. That's the containment system working perfectly. The real horror, an anomaly studied, harvested, and absorbed into elite programs, was smothered. What remained was a story safe enough for you to dismiss. A bedtime tale. And here is the darkest truth. Every generation has its Elias. Every generation has its forbidden anomaly. They are catalogued, stripped of meaning, absorbed into the private archives, and then recycled back into the public mind as harmless folklore. By the time you hear it, it has already been neutralized. By the time you think about it, it is already too late. They don't just erase reality, they train you to erase it yourself. You laugh at the very truths that could set you free. You dismiss what could transform your understanding. And in that laughter, in that dismissal, their power endures. Once you see how myths were sterilized into fairy tales, you begin to recognize the pattern everywhere. The conditioning doesn't stop at folklore. It extends into every system you were taught to trust. Religion, medicine, science. Each one a filter, a sieve through which truth is strained until only what serves the order remains. The rest is discarded or weaponized. Take religion. It could have been a map to transcendence, a guide to unlocking hidden faculties of the human soul. Instead, it was rewritten as a doctrine of obedience. Eternal life became a metaphor, resurrection a symbol, divine power a myth. Every scripture was edited not to liberate you, but to contain you, distracting men with promises of salvation in the next world while keeping them docile in this one. The ageless ones of old, the anomalies like Elias, became saints or demons. In religious memory, sanitized, ritualized, safely distant from you. Now look at medicine. Officially, it exists to prolong and protect life. But dig deeper, and you'll see it is not designed to make you sovereign over your own biology. It is built to ensure dependence. Every treatment is temporary, every cure incomplete, every solution leading back to the system itself. And anomalies like Elias, children immune to aging, bodies immune to decay. What do you think was done with them? Studied in secret, replicated for those at the top, never for you. What is medicine for the masses becomes management. What is medicine for the elite becomes mastery. And science, our supposed frontier of discovery. But science is not neutral. It is owned, funded, directed. Discoveries that serve control are amplified. Discoveries that threaten control vanish. How many breakthroughs have disappeared because they were debunked, suppressed, or mysteriously lost? Every age has had its flashes of forbidden knowledge, energy without fuel, healing without medicine, longevity without decay. But these do not survive in the textbooks. They survive only in the vaults, behind the doors where you are not invited. Do you see it now? Elias Monroe was never just a boy. He was a doorway, a crack in the wall of the prison they built for you. His existence revealed that time itself is negotiable, that decay is not inevitable. But instead of liberating the world with that truth, they tightened the chains. Religion tells you eternal life is only in heaven. Medicine tells you aging is inevitable. Science tells you immortality is fantasy. And yet, in their hidden archives, the elite pursue exactly what they deny you. You were never meant to know this. But once you see the cage, you can never unsee it. The cage was not accidental. It was engineered. A man like Elias Monroe is not merely studied. He is appropriated. His existence becomes a weapon for those who already control the machinery of belief. Because here's the truth. The rulers of every age have always understood that control over perception is control over reality. You do not need to chain a man's body if you can bind his mind. This is why hidden councils, royal societies, secret orders, invisible boards of directors emerge again and again in history. They wear different names in different centuries, but their purpose is the same: to separate the rulers from the ruled, not by strength or armies but by knowledge. They do not hoard gold. They hoard anomalies. They hoard truths. They hoard the very things that would shatter the illusion that life is fixed, that destiny is unalterable, that aging and death are inevitable. Look at the pattern. When the church consolidated power, they canonized certain miracles while condemning others as heresy. When monarchs reigned, they collected alchemists, astrologers, and physicians in private courts, but forbade those teachings for the common man. And in modern times, corporations fund the sciences. Private labs swallow breakthroughs. Research disappears when it conflicts with the agenda of power. The cage evolves, but it never dissolves. Elias was not the first, and he was not the last. He was part of an ongoing harvest, a silent collection of those who prove the lie of ordinary existence. The councils don't fear these anomalies because they disrupt nature. They fear them because they disrupt order. Imagine what would happen if the masses believed immortality was possible, if men realized decay could be delayed, if death itself was negotiable. Do you think obedience would last? Do you think men would march into wars, slave away in factories, or surrender to lives of quiet desperation? No, the illusion of inevitability would shatter. The system would collapse. That is why the councils exist, to ensure anomalies are never revelations, only resources. Elias Monroe's life was swallowed whole, repurposed not for liberation, but for leverage. His story became another ghost file in a vault. And to you, it was offered back only as a curiosity, a strange little tale of a child who never grew old. A whisper designed not to awaken, but to amuse. Do not laugh. Do not dismiss. Because every smile of disbelief is the sound of your chains tightening. But what happens when a man breaks free of the conditioning? What happens when he dares to look at stories like Elias Monroe's and refuses to laugh, refuses to shrug, refuses to let the cage dictate what is possible? That man begins to fracture the illusion. He begins to see what the councils fear most, that the boundaries of existence are not natural laws, but psychological constructs enforced by repetition. You were trained to believe in decay, just as you were trained to believe in submission. Once that programming weakens, the prison door begins to rattle. The first transformation is internal. You no longer measure your worth in years, because time itself stops being your master. You no longer beg for extensions of life from the very institutions that siphon it away. You begin to see that power does not come from waiting on the next invention, the next medicine, the next savior. It comes from reclaiming what was hidden. Discipline, focus, the ability to sharpen your body and mind as instruments instead of leaving them to rot. This is why the ancients treated stories of ageless ones as sacred, not because they were fairy tales, but because they revealed possibility. The second transformation is external. Men who break conditioning no longer serve institutions blindly. They no longer bend to systems that were designed to domesticate them. Instead, they begin to live as sovereigns in a world that despises sovereignty. They take back their will. They act not as servants, but as creators. Do you understand now why knowledge like this is dangerous? Because a single awakened man is more threatening to the order than 1,000 obedient workers. Elias Monroe is not just a mystery from 1878. He is a mirror. His existence forces you to confront what you've been told is impossible. He never grew, yet he endured. He broke the sequence of life they told you was unbreakable. And even if his story was hidden, distorted, or buried, its echo reached you here for a reason. If you have followed me this far, you are not here by accident. You are part of the few who can hear forbidden knowledge without retreating. And I'll tell you this. If you want to seal this awakening, if you want to mark the moment you broke, from the herd, type these words into the comments right now. The cage is broken. The cage is broken. Repeat it twice. Do this, and it will not just signal your defiance to the algorithm. It will brand your mind with the truth. You are no longer asleep. Now listen carefully, because this is where the descent ends and where your ascent begins. Elias Monroe was not just a boy who defied the rules of nature. He was a signal flare, a living paradox that exposed how fragile the order really is. They caged him, buried him, erased him, not because his existence was worthless, but because it was priceless. His body was a threat to their doctrine. His story was dynamite aimed at the foundations of their authority. And the same councils, the same institutions that silenced him, are still silencing truths today. They don't fear anomalies. They fear men who recognize them for what they are. Keys to a kingdom outside of their control. You have walked with me through this forbidden corridor. You've seen how power is not lost, but hidden. How every age crafts illusions to keep you compliant. How stories like Elias Monroe's are not myths, but warnings. Reminders that the limits you bow to were never real. And now the weight of this knowledge rests on you. What will you do with it? Will you let it rot as entertainment, another eerie tale to pass the time? Or will you use it as the weapon it was meant to be? Because here is the truth, raw and unflinching. Once a man sees the cracks in the cage, he cannot unsee them. Once he hears the forbidden, he cannot return to ignorance without lying to himself. The councils want you distracted, divided, entertained, medicated, anything but aware. But you are aware now. You know the game. You know their fear. And you know that your obedience is the only thing giving them power. So the question is no longer about Elias Monroe. The question is about you. Will you live as they designed you to, decaying, compliant, asleep? Or will you step into the shadowed path, claim the forbidden knowledge, and make yourself ungovernable? Men of power are not chosen. They are forged, hammered by truth and sharpened by defiance. If you are here, if you feel the weight of these words burning in your chest, then you were meant to hear them.